Hey everybody, welcome back to Bug Proletariat 40K, and this week we're going to cover an in-depth overview of the secondaries in Warzone Nephilim for Gene Stealer cults. One of our biggest strengths before Warzone Nephilim for Gene Stealer cults definitely was the secondaries. You know, I would say we're probably the best army in the game at the secondary advantage just because we go scored R&D so easily. We had a really good secondary in Brood Swarm in the Battlefield Supremacy slot, but we're still pretty good at Engage and could even take behind enemy lines if we build our list for it. And as far as the third secondary, we could really flex into stuff like 2 Patriarch lists could take 2 to the last, or Psychic Interrogation was very, very good still for us, and actually Pierce the Veil and some of the diagonal deployments was awesome as well. But moving into Nephilim, a lot of factions now have the ability to have 3 solid choices or 2 solid choices and 1 flex pick into us, which, like, no prisoners or assassinate, we give up a lot. So we kind of lost that secondary advantage coming into Nephilim, and I want to do a video of how to pick secondaries, kind of knowing that in Nephilim most armies are going to score higher in that secondary category than they did previously. First, we'll take a look at the generic secondaries that anybody can take from the perspective of a Gene Stealer cults player. So obviously we're still pretty good at Engage, even with the newer rule of you have to be 6 inches out of the center and really into that table quarter. We really don't care about this rule. We're dropping in with our ambush and our coming up from blips and things like that. So we can still score really, really well as far as Engage. Now, Engage is in the same category as Brood Swarm, and I really like Brood Swarm a lot more, which we'll talk about on our next slide here. But if Brood Swarm's not an option, say you're playing like, Horde Imperial Guard or Demons that are going to come out shortly, or something that just has a ton of models on the table, which isn't super popular right now, so Brood Swarm should be totally viable in most games, you can definitely look at this Engage and still know that you're going to get a really solid score from it. The downside of Engage is it's really unpredictable as far as Gene Stealer cults go. Brood Swarm was put in there, in my mind, by the developers of the game because we're the army that's gonna, at the end of the game, not have a lot on the table. We're pretty fragile, and we're just gonna be holding on, by the skin of our teeth in turns 4 and 5. And Brood Swarm really lets us do that by scoring a lot of points early by having more models on the table total, and no enemies in our deployment zone, and kind of taper off at the end of the game when we might have less models on the table and to score less from it. Engage is kind of the opposite, and you need to have models throughout the entire game in not just 3 quarters, because that's only going to get you 10 points, which in the Nephilim secondary world is just not going to cut it a lot of the times. But you're going to have models in all 5 turns in all 4 table quarters, which could be tough. So Engage is really easy to get 10, but in some games, 10 is a bad Brood Swarm score as far as I'm concerned, especially with how popular Knights are. But like I said, some games you're just not going to be able to take Brood Swarm, so feel free to look to Engage, just knowing that you might get not as many points. Behind enemy lines is still very good for us. It does get a little tough because you're trying to get 2 units in your opponent's deployment zone. For that 4 points, you just have to do that really 3 times during the game, right? And you're looking at a 12, which is very respectable, even now with the Nephilim secondaries. So if you have like fast-moving Twisted Helix Gene Stealers, bikes of any kind that can get behind or in your opponent's deployment zone by charging things naturally, not just coming down from underground and from reserves, it's really going to help out to get your score more stabilized and behind enemy lines. Because while might take things like R&D and you're going to be in your enemy's deployment zone anyway, with deep striking with lying in wait or just coming in within 6 and not charging, you're going to want at least a 3rd or even a 4th turn to get max points from it to have units in your opponent's deployment zone, and those fast units really help with that. So if you build your list to behind enemy lines, it can be an easy 12 and sometimes even more than that for you. It just can be a little risky, again, because GSC is so fragile. But if you know you're not going to take Brute Swarm too many times and Engage kind of scares you because it's harder to plan for, then definitely throw things in your list that can score you some easy behind enemy line points. And GSC is actually one of the few factions that this is not a terrible secondary for, and things can work out for you. Retrieve Nephilim data is still amazing for GSC. You're going to get 12 points every game for this. In basically all of my list, I take 2 5-man Acolyte squads, 1 with lying in wait usually, and 1 just with nothing to score this. And the bonus to this is the 1 lying in wait squad a lot of times can come in within 3 and onto my opponent's primary objectives. If they haven't played Gene Stealer Cult before, or if they just don't have a lot of models, it's tough to fully block out those full 6-inch circle of an objective, so it's easy to come in and maybe steal your opponent's primary and score R&D at the same time, which is awesome. I put raised banners down at the bottom, but it's in the same category, so I'll talk about it now. There are some games that raised banners is a better pick than R&D, especially now that your opponent only takes your banners down in a command phase instead of at the end of any phase, so you get a chance to actually hit them back and if they charge onto one of your objectives. And missions like the mission 11, where it's 3 objectives really close to you, 3 objectives really close to your opponent, it's easy to just turn 1, pop up those 3 banners, and as long as you have enough OBSEC on the table and you're planning to fight your opponent on their side of the table, which very much should be your plan in missions like this, you're going to get a ton of points for banners because you're going to proc at the end of the game another score from banners as well. You get 1 point for every banner at the end of the game, as well as in your command phase you get a point for each banner. So in this category I would pretty much always take Retrieve Nephilim data, and sometimes banners is the better choice, but only on those certain missions that you have 3 objectives extremely close to your deployment zone and your opponent doesn't really have the army that's going to come over and mess with your banners too much. So into another category, which sometimes ends up being my flex category for GSC outside of Battlefield Supremacy and Shadow Operations, is the Psychic category. Psychic Interrogation is just amazing with the 24 inches, don't need line of sight, and if you roll over, or it might be even equal to, your opponent's leadership or the character's leadership, you get a command point, which is like gold now in Nephilim. So I take this a lot. Now you do need to build 2 Psychers in your list, I would say, like a Patriarch and a Magus. It's tough to play this, and I have tried it with just a 1 Magus list, and while I scored a lot of Psychic Interrogation, you definitely do miss your +1 attack powers from Life from Beyond, your Mass Hypnosis, your Psychic Stimulus. So for that reason, I always build at least 2 Psychers into my lists. And I always take Psychic Interrogation over a Warp Ritual. I mean, it's just so easy for our characters to get within 24 of enemy characters. It would have to be a really specific situation, maybe AdMech or Guard, where their characters really have no incentive to come out of their deployment zone, and it might be a little tougher to get to them with all the screening units they have, where I would take something like Warp Ritual. A lot of times our army, again, this is the 3rd time I think I'm saying it in 5 minutes, is very fragile, so it's going to be tough for us to stick in the middle and keep that Psyker alive to cast 3 times for the good amount of points in Warp Ritual. Warp Ritual, casting twice is probably very doable, but it's only 7 points, and that's really going to hurt you when it comes down to see who's going to win if it's a close game. And I put as the last one up there as one of the generic secondaries you look at as Assassinate. Assassinate can be very much a trap. I know playing into some of my GSC lists, Assassinate's a trap. Sure, I have 4 characters, but none of them need to exist outside my deployment zone, and they will be the last things you kill. If you kill my entire army, great, I'm probably losing anyway. And I know a lot of other armies can do that as well with their characters, where they don't need to necessarily come at you, and they're totally fine just hiding like Farseers behind all their stuff and casting powers all game. So that would be the situations you definitely don't want to take Assassinate. But if you're really looking for that 3rd secondary, and the GSC ones, which we'll talk about in a second, aren't really going to help you out, and you don't think Psychic Interrogation or Warp Ritual is going to be good for you, or you didn't build a second Psyker into your list. You know, Assassinate can be a solid 9-ish points into things like Blood Angels, whose character is going to come at you and you're going to really try and kill anyway. And if you have things like the Kellermore for a couple snipers, we can definitely build into it, but it's not my favorite secondary. But I guess don't forget, it's there in an emergency. So now we'll talk about the GSC specific ones. So now that you can take all 3 of these, theoretically, and all factions can do that, that's kind of what's going to push everybody's secondary score a little higher. People just have more options than they did before Warzone Nephilim. Like Space Marines, for example, all the sub-factions got their own secondary and still have Oath of Moment, which got a little worse, but means that they have an easy third secondary sometimes to pick from, other than like Iron Hands, who have to kill things with vehicles, which isn't amazing. So we got the same treatment. Brute Swarm got a little buff and is awesome, because we're just typically going to have more models on the whole table than our opponent in the first few turns, and that's getting us a point, and we can surge into no man's land and hold our deployment zone very well to get, you know, at least 3 points a turn early from Brute Swarm, and with our ability to pick units up and put them back into Deep Strike and Deep Strike into our opponent's deployment zone with lying in wait or coming in 6 inches away. It's pretty easy to get a 5-point turn from Brute Swarm just by having more models on the table, your deployment zone, no man's land, and your opponent's deployment zone. And just one 5-point turn from Brute Swarm kind of guarantees, in my mind, that you're going to get over 10 or 12 for this secondary, which you're really looking for to eke out those extra points if the game's going to be close. Brute Swarm, I found I've taken almost every game into almost all my opponents. The only time I really haven't taken it is into my buddy's guard list, who has like 120 bodies in it. But at that point, you don't really need to take Brute Swarm. There's other secondaries that you can play, obviously, like No Prisoners into him. But I found with how popular Chaos Knights are, it's an auto 15, and it really helps us out when they start to do things like take away our OPSEC, for example. Ambush, I wasn't very high on this when it first came out or was, changed for Nephilim. You can get 4 points a turn now from it, and killing things by coming in from ambush or underground gets 2 points now, and exposed gets 2 points, so it's kind of easier to get a better score for this. A perfect example of when not to take this was my second game in my last RTT. I played Death Guard, and I built my list with one Psyker, which was just a mistake on my part, so I wasn't comfortable taking a Psychic secondary as my third secondary. And I took this thinking, my seismic cannons will come down and kill some things, mining weapons will come down with acolytes and charge things and kill things, and just, it didn't play out that way. Things would come down and do damage, but not completely finish off units, and I would need that extra turn from when the acolytes would die, and then seismic cannons would shoot them next turn, but getting no ambush points. So a lot of things are tougher now, especially with Armor Contempt, and Death Guard was the perfect example of when not to take it. Just make sure your shooting, your charges are actually going to finish off units completely, or you won't be getting any points for ambush. Or you might be only getting that 1 point for killing something with a crossfire token on it, which just isn't going to cut it. And then we come to my least favorite secondary ever, Sabotage Critical Location. I didn't even name it in my last video, and I know I got some grief in the comments for it, but I just don't understand how you could pick this over banners if it works in that mission, or especially R&D, when you can almost guarantee to get 12 points from R&D with really little, it's not going to take a mastermind to get 12 points from R&D from GSC. It's just so easy for your opponent, if you take this, once you explain it to them, to stop you from scoring it. The only thing they need to do is make sure that you can't perform that action at the end of the move unit step on wherever they put their critical locations that your opponent gets to pick. So this means no coming in from lying in wait and doing this action early on turns 2 or 3. And all your opponent has to do is take a squad of 5 intercessors and put them in a tiny ring right around it. They can even put the sabotage critical location right on top of their home objectives if there's two, and that's where they're going to want their interceptors anyway, and you can't move onto it because you can't be within an inch of an enemy model unless you're charging them in the move units phase, end of the move unit step. And just how fragile GSC are, you're not going to be able to perform this action. Now, I have no doubt there's going to be some times when you're playing someone maybe, not skilled at the game, and you explain this secondary to them and they don't understand that, and you can get it done early. And the upside is if you do this very early, you'll get more points than R&D. I pretty much never want to take that risk in assuming that my opponent is going to play poorly. I would rather 10 games out of 10 take the 12 guarantee points from retrieve Nephilim data than bank that I can throw 2 units away by performing this action who can literally do nothing else that turn. And this unit is one that can't deep strike down and do it, has to actually move onto the location and perform actions. So that means they're not advancing or shooting or charging. So really the name of the game for GSC for picking secondaries is picking between one, battlefield supremacy, either engage behind enemy lines or brute swarm. And it's pretty obvious when you should pick brute swarm, and that should always be your first go-to if you think that's gonna be a viable option for you. So once you've made that check, like, okay, I can't take brute swarm, now we're gonna move on to, should I take engage or should I take behind enemy lines? And behind enemy lines is very much something that you had to have built your list for and planned around. So if that's not you, not coming into the table knowing that you can do it, just take engage and know that you're gonna have to play slightly differently than you would normally by getting units fully within those table quarters outside of 6 of the center. Then you're gonna move on for your second choice to shadow operations, which, great news here is you can take R&D every single game, pretty much bank on 12 points. And as long as you threw in, a couple of 5-man acolyte squads for 45 points in your list, you're gonna be able to get 12 points from this. It's extremely hard for your opponent to, block you out of table quarters when you can come within 3 with lying in wait, or within 6 and not charge. And even if they do block you out, because you're only going to be able to bring those units down within 6 or 3 with lying in wait on turns 2 and 3. And good opponents will know this, and they've done it to me in the past, where they block you out in turns 2 and 3, and well, that's fine, just use your lying in wait instead to steal a primary objective or something like that, and then later in the game you can spend 1 CP to return to the shadows a unit, and then they can come back later when your opponent has less models on the table, hopefully if things are going well, and do that last R&D in whatever table quarter you still need it in. So if you're playing one of the missions where banners is the better pick, typically it's going to be mission 11, or missions where you have 3 objectives close to you and into an opponent who isn't going to get to you that quickly and isn't going to tear down all your banners before the end of the game, because you really do want those end of game scoring banner points. Definitely feel free to take that and just break in the free points basically. And now comes to the real, what's going to separate a win from a loss sometimes is going to be that third secondary pick between you and your opponent. And with GSC, your opponent is a lot of times going to have that assassinate, which sometimes, like I said, can be a trap if the game is going well, but GSC is so fragile that sometimes they're just going to get to a couple characters and get a decent score from it. Or things like no prisoners, where a lot of our lists just give up a ton of points anyway. Look at that third secondary choice from your opponent, knowing that if they take that, no prisoners, my list typically gives up 10 if you table me, and then you get those 2 bonus points. So I'm looking at, I know my opponent could score 12 if everything goes good for them. So when I look at it and I know I also need to score 12, that's why the 2 psychers are built on my list, so I can take things like psychic interrogation, or as long as I'm within 24 inches of a character of theirs, 4 turns out of the game, typically I can cast it 4 times pretty reliably and get that 12 points that I need. And then if you look at a list, or you built your list in a way that you don't feel comfortable taking one of those psychic secondaries, that's when you start to look at things like ambush. But now we're even narrowing the scope even further, because that's not great into, you know, a list like right here, the orcs, buggies. That ambush is not going to be a great pick for us. Into the Tau, where that player had 3 hammerheads, 2 planes, and some crisis suits. Ambush is, again, not a great pick. And into that Tau, actually, psychic interrogation was not a good pick, because that his character's commander and his ethereal could sit in the back the entire game. So you really have to know what your third secondary is going to be in a situation like that in order to get you the most amount of points. I believe in that Tau game, actually, just to finish out the example, I took Warp Ritual knowing I can cast this twice and score 7, and if things go okay, I can sacrifice my last Psyker and run up there and get it a third time, I hope. I believe I ended up just getting 7 for it and getting tabled by this Tau player. So hopefully that breakdown of the Nephilim secondaries kind of helps the next time you're playing your GSC into some other games. It can be confusing to newer players, especially with the GSC, picking the correct secondaries. GSC is such a hard army to play, so you're already at, I would say, a disadvantage into the other, you know, more easy mode armies that are more resilient and maybe have super good secondaries like Necrons. But once you kind of get the gist of, you know, I can comfortably choose R&D, Brute Swarm's really, really good, you can start to see how powerful some of the GSC secondaries are and their secondary game can be. And then you just have to worry about holding the primary, and you're going to start winning. Thanks everybody for listening again, and I hope to have another battle report out relatively soon. I'll probably be playing some more Twisted Helix, and as far as the battle reports go, I might try and start building some wonky builds for GSC just to see how to experiment and see if there's anything hidden in the codex maybe we haven't found yet, because if anybody's looked at the tournament data for the past few weeks, GSC have taken quite a hit, unfortunately, to their win rate. I mean, they weren't winning events before, but we were right around the 50% mark, but I think we're slowly dropping, and that's a mix of, I believe, factions getting easier secondaries to score, Armor of Contempt for sure hurts us a lot, and people just realize how to play in the Genestealer Cult a little more aggressively, and it's really hard for you, if your opponent pushes hard into you with your fragile bodies, to come back from that. Everybody, thanks for listening, and until next time, good luck with your GSC games out there.